reaching a new audience. And so I'm pretty excited to talk to you today about this idea of matter-of-fact gameplay, which is a setting that exists and is in somewhat persistence as the characters enter into it. And a lot of the decisions when faced with a new horizon, say a character goes into a back room of a kitchen, what do you do to answer the questions of what is inside that kitchen? Well, there are new approaches and there are older approaches, and there are, I guess you could say, classical approaches, which is what I'm going to be talking about here, which is to say matter-of-fact gameplay. So to get the ball rolling, let's rewind a little bit and let's look at some comments from the previous stream, because I talked about how you can let your thinking be influenced by encounter design and challenges when you're approaching games from an aesthetic story of the character's perspective, or sometimes when the game system itself places those expectations on you, either passively or actively as the game master, to place challenges in front of the characters. And that's sort of your primary task when combats and obstacles are arising, is to think of those combats and obstacles first as obstacles for the characters. That's the reason they're arising, rather than that they were persistent in the world. And I was using this term matter-of-fact gameplay, and I hit upon it, and it seems to really have struck a chord with a number of folks, referring to this idea that you can work in a perspective of emergent gameplay with a kind of persistent setting where we avoid making aesthetic or editorial decisions about what's over the next hill based on what the character needs or what the player wants or you yourself want as the game master, and instead we sort of ask, what makes sense? And I say this in a very simple way because there are aspects of genre that can engage with this. It's not just a matter of reality or simulation. And there's a little bit of a tension around this because I know that genre mechanics, the idea that Moxie and Tinkerbell effects and Born Winners, in some respects, conflict with a lot of older school thinking. I don't necessarily think that's the case obligatorily. And I'll get into that. And I'll try and kind of set things up so that you can opt into a universe where destiny is a real force, where law and chaos and good and evil are real cosmic forces, or where weapons of legend and legendary heroes are something that are almost diegetically believed in by the characters in the world. And so, yes, perhaps there is a legendary weapon in a vault several hills over. But does that appear because a new character has arrived? Does the shape of that weapon change to become a great axe because the player's character is very fond of axes? Or is it the legendary sword that it always was in the setting material? And that's where some of the divide pulls apart as far as genre assumptions. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I want to really paint out a little bit more of that scene that I mentioned at the beginning here, which is to say, the character's in a tavern, and after hours, they're sleepless. They've been abstemious from drink, where their companions have become inebriated, and they venture downstairs to the kitchen because perhaps they just need a snack, or they're just curious, they're inquisitive, they're that sort of player. I know that I like to experiment with my invisibility spell on traveling days as a wizard in BXD&D. Sometimes I snoop around, and you could think of my wizard as flirting with a certain dark side of invisible man behavior. And that's some of the tension in his character, is that his power tempts him to be a little bit of a weirdo in some respect. Suffice it to say, whether that's an in-character motivation or just a acquisitive motivation, or sometimes players will do things just to throw you off, or that's how they will talk about it in some cultures of play. Suffice it to say, you may have never considered what that kitchen in the tavern looks like. Now, Some people will refer to things like the rule of cool and to say yes or roll the dice as maxims which defend an idea that what is in that kitchen is something that will be interesting to the story and especially relevant to the character, rather than what could make sense, what is connected, what is thematically appropriate to the setting, or possibly, what fits with the genre, given the kind of moment and pacing that the story inhabits right now. In other words, what makes sense in the Mos Eisley Cantina can include in a genre like Star Wars. It can include the idea that there needs to be a mythical ruffian that is going to, ruffle the feathers of the hero as he's venturing into the wider world. And perhaps that's a reason that Ponda Baba and Dr. Urzavan are there to challenge and to try and start a fight. There's a debate over that. But suffice it to say, the answer is not directly tied to what would suit Luke Skywalker to be behind the curtain in that kitchen. It's not what would suit Pippin or Mariodoc Brandybuck. There's not necessarily a bunch of sausages and, a full submarine sandwich ready to go. It's not a matter of that. It's a matter of what kind of tavern is this? What goes on thematically or based on the guidelines that we set down of what is in the back room of taverns in this kind of setting. So this could be that, people are engaged in illicit acts or just adulterous ones because this is a private area. This could be that this is an after-hours area where someone who's a very passionate alchemist makes use of the kitchen facilities to explore their craft and the only time of day that they can. And there might be one of the folks that work the tavern during the day and they're burning the midnight oil. Those answers can all be connected and sensical. Depends on what sort of thoughts we've had about the density, the regularity of if these things are rare or hard to find, uncommon. What's the chance of a coincidence? Are coincidences a big part of this genre as they are in Star Wars? Oh, funny meeting you here. Oh, I thought you were on the other side of the galaxy. Nope, I'm here. And of course, that's a huge part of many space opera genres. And for that matter, Game of Thrones sort of turned out that way, at least in the television form. So that can make sense to have contrived coincidences based on the genre, if you're choosing to play in that kind of genre. However, you can play in a more truthful is, or simulationist, reality-based is sort of a separate question than if you're playing in a matter-of-fact way, to my mind. Because the answer to these questions are like, would it be great for your character? Would we speed things up? Would it spice things up as a session? Or what makes sense based on the way that we're playing? So let's do some contrasting here. What is matter-of-fact gameplay not? What does it not look like? And I'm going to give you some examples. The first one is Professor Dungeon Master likes to talk about how there's no need to really understand what the difficulty class of a given leap is. Leaping 20 feet is not something that you, as the Dungeon Master, need to understand. What a banded iron chest with a clockwork mechanism and an acid spray back blast that will also set afire the contents of the chest if you fail to disarm the trap. You don't need to have a precise formula in your head to answer that question. And I would agree. But he says the reason that you don't need to answer that question, that you don't need to understand a formula, his reasoning is because the question before you is just, is this a time that you want to challenge the character? Is this a challenging chest for this character? Not what kind of chest is this, or who made this chest, or who is this character relative to chests in this world. You can put some puns in there if you like. But instead, is this leap across a chasm something that you want to challenge this player with? Okay, well then you just make up a number. You just say you need to roll a 15, basically. And you can back calculate based on their modifier. That is not grounded in the reality of the world. Instead, those decisions are being aesthetically made based on the character in some respects. And that's where the contrast is. And where I think that these are two differing schools of thought. And that's why I want to talk about matter-of-fact gameplay as something distinct today. So let's move on. The example that we see before on our screen is what set me on this path to creating this narrative about matter-of-fact gameplay. This is a Sly Flourish article, and in it, the idea of tuning monsters, tuning the difficulty of an encounter in the middle of the encounter is put forward. So the idea is that you could change the number of hit points on the monster in the middle of the fight. It just changes to change how difficult the encounter would be based on whether it feels right or how much time you have left in the session. And would this make a good campaign? Would people have fun? And so there's an editorial aspect where the game master is being called on to sort of empathize and construct an experience for people, as opposed to everyone is playing together, game master, players, and that, you're in this other world. The game master is responsible for fairly representing forces of genre, fairly representing the established paradigm, i.e., cities are 100 miles apart, not 50. And so there's where the things are pulling apart. And this article advocates for, what will make the game more fun right now is the relevant question. Not, is it real? What's really there? And frankly, I agree that some battles will be easy because the game is about heroic characters. Often, the game is calibrated so that the characters have unusual degrees of survivability and rare powers like magic, and that's understood as part of gameplay, and it's an assumption which underlies the system. However, the persistent reality of the world, you could say the objective reality, is in the contrasting school which I'm putting forward, persistent and real. And so this is where I really differ. And I basically would never do these sorts of things, or I would need to see some sort of genre reason that would motivate me towards it. This is, there's a fortune mechanic in Conan 2.20, which can allow Deus Ex Machina and contrivances like there is a cave that you could hide in, or there is an exceptionally good barrel of oil that you can flash, can push over and set a fire and deal with the number of enemies and reduce it. And that this is, the uncanny luck of the heroes is actually dignified as a game mechanic. And in some respects, for me, that separates it from, any aesthetics of my own. I get to play as the game master. I get to inhabit the world too. I don't have to, compartmentalize my brain and say, is that fair? Is that real? I have to micromanage my relationship with you as the player, and I have to seem like I'm being, equally kind and giving everybody a nice balanced number of gimmies. And that kind of social thinking, especially for me as a neurodiverse person, it really takes me out of my third eye, frankly. And it really makes the world and the enjoyment of the imaginative portion of the game more distant. And that sort of feels political when I don't have a mechanic like that. Let's look at another Sly Flourish article, which is more enduring, and which I've seen a lot of the Sly Flourish fan club pushing as, really almost messianic. And that it's really super useful. Now, 5e, of course, is a game which is heroic, but nevertheless, this thinking it's influencing the rest of the hobby. and it's influencing people's basic assumptions when they tell a tale about how their game, any RPG, went, and they say that the game master, refused to change the encounter and killed all our characters, or the game master refused for there to be a horse for my character to, at the end of the boat journey. And, I had specifically built my character around being a mounted combatant. I wanted to be a paladin who specialized in lance stuff. And, my question is, in some respects, how core is mounted combat to the genre aesthetic that you're playing in? And, who undertook this boat journey and why? And there's lots of questions which erupt. Suffice it to say, people will critique that. And I've seen, the matter-of-fact gameplay and some of the decision-making which I engage in as a game master. I've seen people say, that looks like a red flag. You should have known right then that this was a bad GM. And I've seen this, literally referred to in that way as a reaction to some people's stories about unfortunate things happening with their characters. And for me, I just want to say it's not exactly a red flag. It's a difference of style. And there is a logic to this, which is not just a competitive logic. And frankly, the competitive logic of trying to get gimmies or gotchas or, trying to really one-up the party is in fact antithetical to matter-of-fact gameplay. So the real critique that I want to give about, the Sly Flourish stuff, which I think is really the reason that I've decided to, start talking about this, is because it's getting so hot right now and everybody wants to talk about it, is that, let's look at this right here. The determination of if the encounter is deadly in this special rubric is entirely based on the challenge rating of the monsters. Now, monster challenge rating is a pretty opaque concept in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Wouldn't you agree? There's no set formula that you get told what the challenge rating is based on the monster manual. And yet, nevertheless, it's regarded as really equivalent to the deadliness of the monster, not the challengingness of it. For example, there can be very frustrating monsters, like Griggs and other Fae, that can really consume resources, distract, and pull the party away from their goal. And that's a legitimate reason within the rubric of the challenge rating system for something to have a higher challenge rating. And then there are things like a Gorgon or a Cockatrice and the like that will turn some party members to stone, which is inconvenient, but often not exactly deadly. And, it may just cause a 1-day delay as some party members are revived with a flesh to stone, or stone other way around, the reversal of the spell. And the calibration for these things is influenced by questions like that. Rust Monster, for example, will take away your plate mail. It's very unlikely to be deadly. That's a consequence-based question in large part. And so, it's really, the forest and the trees are really blurred here. And yet, we're being called on to say the army of Quotwa in the Shrine to the Fish God is not actually 18. It should be 16 monsters, that's guarding the inner shrine. And we should probably remove that lightning rod that the champion of the fish god has, because that's going to make things a little bit too tough. Now, chat is very lively, and I can see it out of the other corner of my eye. And I'm looking forward to getting engaged with y'all. But I do want to kind of round out this initial discussion before we move on to some of the more debated or interactive aspects of the stream, which I've really been looking forward to this one. And if you can't tell, I'm a bit prepared. And I'm drinking special mushroom juice that they say helps improve your thinking. So I wanted to give a few more examples of this paradigm in memes as a representation of popular culture, or the assumed culture that people are trying to communicate with one another about. And so in this one, somebody created, this idea that, oh, what are you trying to tell me? That I can fudge dice? And the a very experienced dungeon master says, I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to. Now, there's two ways to interpret this. One of them is that people will understand that you're just fair, and that what happens and what occurs in the story is a matter of the genre. It's a matter of cause and effect and emergent situations, and that, sometimes bad stuff happens, sometimes good stuff happens. The other way, which I think that the author of this meme was thinking of, was you can force it. You don't have to fudge dice. You can just force it. You can just make the monster have extra HP. There's always an ogre down this path. You don't need to roll for a random encounter, because the quantum ogre will always be on whatever path the party is going down. Now, quantum superposition is a concept which I don't think is incompatible with matter-of-fact gameplay, but assuming that it's okay because you're the aesthetic determiner, that, you can just make up your mind about whether there will be an ogre or not, that's not matter-of-fact gameplay. To quote Albert Einstein, God does not play dice. And what I mean by that is that if you are the game master, and I don't really like this idea of deifying the game master, but I'll do it for analogies purposes right now. You set it down and you take it out of your hands. That's what it means to roll for a die, in my mind. So another aspect of that, or another clearer aspect of that, and one which is antagonized here, is the idea that, there's a determined or railroaded assumed outcome, which can often happen in an adventure module. To give an example of this, in Jade Regent Book 3, which I ran once, or I tried to, it's assumed that in the course of a Viking funeral, there's going to be a very important sword which is cast off into the ocean along with the boat, and it is set afire. And that the party, in order to retrieve this very important sword, will wait until it is set off into the ocean before the flaming arrow is shot, and then they will secretly kayak across the water using some misty spell, which an NPC will, guide them through it, and they'll have a railroady encounter with a giant crab on the beach, and then they'll just go to the boat and they'll take the sword. This defies all logic to me, because the players were, avidly pursuing just asking the Viking family for the sword. They were avidly pursuing, diplomacy. The paladin even tried to challenge to single combat the representative of the deceased. And I think they even offered to have themselves geist. We will go on a quest bound by magic and, a blood oath to do this for you. And these are things that they were actively considering, and there was literally no material about the Viking family. There was no material about what sort of offers or diplomacy they would be receptive to. And instead, there was this weird, bizarre sidetrack with kayaks and a forced encounter with a crab. And that's the style of play which is assumed in that module. All right. Let's move on to, I think this is maybe our last example. What does the NPC know? Does the NPC know things that logically they would know? That they've acquired this knowledge by doing things? Does Gandalf realize that the presence in the south of Mirkwood is in fact Sauron reformed and reborn? Does he know this because the narrator gave him this knowledge? Or does he know this because he's been running all over Middle-earth constantly, just constantly gathering knowledge, and, decides to go for a main chance and goes to Barad-dûr. I think that's the name of that one. I might be wrong. So the question is, how do you know this? And sometimes some people will answer this question with, it's not important. That, that this is not something which you need to consider. Now, I think that you can, in the moment, offer some information, especially early on in a campaign, by way of an NPC. And you don't need to have everything figured out. But the impact of that later on is cumulative. You need to acknowledge those creative or momentary decisions by saying, well, if this person knows this, they're the sort of person that knows it. There's a finite number of people who are able to have this special kind of knowledge. And also we've set up that this person is acquiring this knowledge, and they possibly have, mid and high level allies that they're sharing information with. The Dunedain Rangers, at some point, that role may become occupied by the Dungeons and Dragons party. In that, what I mean to say is that at some point, the patron may not know things because you're the person who's supposed to find it out for them. And, that responsibility of knowledge gathering is something which mechanically, I believe that we're told by the Dungeons and Dragons rulebooks, it becomes more and more the responsibility of the player characters. Older editions, of course, had strongholds, which, suggested that party members were going to become more involved in politics and have their ear to the wall, that they would essentially have friends. But even in newer editions, there are things like Scry, there are things like Teleport, which allow you to run yourself ragged across Middle-earth during, what I will call semi-downtime or non-combat world voyaging to engage with the world. GM, please, throw me a bone here. Why don't you pull me along with the plot thread? I'm getting really bored here. Where's the main idea? And, often, I find myself in this situation. It's like, well, I expected you guys would learn how to go find it yourself by now. Isn't that the fun of having all these abilities? And, the end, or the kind of the end game of this other school of thought is the say yes or roll the dice, or / just say yes. As in, the butler did it. That's my catchphrase that I've been saying. Yeah, the butler totally did it, guys. It was the butler. Yep, you were right. There was a murder and it was the butler. When you hear speculation from the players, their speculation becomes the reality. Now this is, and it fundamentally, the reality kind of changes to make that speculation true, and that validation is somehow joyous, or that it's good. And again, one is asked to consider what is the emotional paradigm with other people, and what would be a satisfying or entertaining thing to happen to the humans in front of you. Which again, as a neurodiverse person, I really struggle with that kind of social multitasking. Like, I can do the job of role-playing the NPCs and thinking about the world, trying to remember the forces of genre, trying to remember all the different things going on with the rules, and, the non-rule items, which I need to adequately consider and simulate, like sighting distances, weather, economy. Or I can, think about the passions of the particular people in a moment-to-moment fashion and read their faces and so on. And often, literally, I most of my memories of playing D&D, I imagine the faces of the characters. As a DM, I actually have very clear memories of the faces of the characters that my wife played, even. I don't really remember her face at the table rolling dice as much as I remember her character in the world when I look back. And maybe this is because I'm just a total weirdo. But suffice it to say, I find that these are two different visual spaces in my mind's eye. Is imagining empathically how someone else feels here versus imagining this world. This is maybe summed up in the contrasted in a different way, and this might be a touchstone for you, is George R. R. Martin often says, I think there are two types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. Now, obviously, we may not get the 7th volume of Game of Thrones, but is that important to this quote? The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They know how many rooms are going to be in the house, what kind of roof they're going to have, and where the wires are going to run. That's the big one, as far as the plot. And what kind of plumbing there's going to be. The gardeners dig a hole, drop a seed in it, and water it. They know what kind of seed it is. See, this is the thing, is that you can decide, and you have some say in creating the species of plants in your world when you're a matter-of-fact game master. You still get to choose what sort of seeds are going into the ground. Not necessarily which ones will sprout, but there's still a lot of aesthetic and world building feeling, and there's still a lot of joy in discovering, which of your creations will survive or become treasured, and just create a lot of them. And this will challenge you. Don't name every NPC, of course, but think about what NPCs would be there to make sense. Fill out the world, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that down the line. I think it's about time with the idea that one of the informing principles of this kind of setting is lamp shading, as it's derisively referred to in the television and the film world. That's how things work around here. We put lampshades on. Well, that's how that works. We need to use words to cast spells. We have a spell book. That's my spell book over there, and that acknowledging it sort of legitimizes it. But when you're working in this living paradigm, where you're not producing scripts, where the actors are not reading a script even when they're method act, this whole idea that being in character is method acting. Oh, I got another stream about that. Suffice it to say, I think that the way that Gundams work and the way that they emerged as part of the need for helium from space, if I understand correctly, and that fusion reactors, yada, 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 it legitimizes and it places constraints upon how Gundams work in that universe. I'm not an expert about that one. Likewise, until recently, or maybe just during the Next Generation era, there's a debate about it. The technical underpinnings of certain parts of the Star Trek world, when it came to the limitations of different devices, the dangers of using them, the ways that they could break, there were sort of established rules that you learned about and which became relevant. And as a viewer and an engaged fan who was creating things, those logics allowed you to create your own stuff. So I knew as a kid that you needed matter and antimatter to make a warp reactor, and that space was folded in front of the ship using Cochrane coils, or warp coils, which their force is and their ability to warp space is measured in Cochranes. That the plasma that is resultant from reacting the antimatter with deuterium is pumped throughout the ship, and so that the superheated plasma is actually the conduit for energy. I knew this as a kid, so that there's no wires. There's not exactly like power lines through the ship, because the power demands are such that any wire would instantly melt. So only magnetically contained plasma can deliver the energy. And that explains why the walls are always exploding and why there's huge fires that people have to, rush past in the hallways on Star Trek. And, these are things which inform you as you establish the what can't happen. And that's I think an important part of Raymond Chandler is an author that said, when things get dull, have a man with a gun come through the door. If anything, if all else fails, if the pace is slowing, spice it up. And this is another element of our contrasting school of thought, that the laws of pacing are really important. That what's around the next corner, or what the reason for rolling a random encounter is to rush things along. It's to make the players feel like something's biting at their back, rather than to represent that there's a lot of things around that are bubbling around in the world, doing their own thing, that you may come into contact with, and that this is something which is outside of my control as the game master. That I cannot logically simulate where everything is at all times, where the hunting parties of orcs are, where the rangers patrol the wilderness looking for those same orcs. I don't know where all they are. They all are at any given time. That would be silly to try and track all those things. So we abstracted into a frequency, that a chance that in certain terrains you may encounter these things, that you may sight these things from a distance that the encounter table says, based on the terrain, you may sight them from, which is not the same thing as a combat. And that's the other thing, is that, You know, in the Raymond Chandler school, a random encounter is a random combat. It's a random confrontation. It's not a sighting. It's not a observing a giant in his natural habitat, plucking a hippopotamus from the river to take back to a barbecue with his family. You know, a hill giant, for example. I'm just imagining something. You know, so if I rolled a hill giant encounter, does it mean that the hill giants are going to be angry and confront your party? Or does it mean that they're going about their business because this is their territory? And it may be a question of, you know, if the encounter is far enough away, you may not lose stealth. And, you know, they're preoccupied with their own situation. Are you going to attack them? You know, and last time I did this, and this is a sort of an actual true story of an encounter, I rolled some hill giants, and they also had some human captives that they were dragging around, that they had strung up on a chain, and that were helping them kind of with their hunt, but were also, you know, it was joked that if they didn't succeed in their hunt, they would just eat one of them. And that this was overheard, and there was a moral motivating force also. And, you know, this is one of those things about impacts and vacuums that, as we consider, is that, you know, if we leave out what's sinister about these adversaries, and if we don't push that they're forcibly confronting the party, then the thing that animates the characters to choose to be heroic, which I think most people would agree is part of the genre, is that the characters are going to go do strong, heroic things or risk themselves in it. Or maybe they'll do picaresque kind of mischievous things like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse. You know, they'll try and get rich and spend it all on booze and hookers, which, you know, to them they're the heroes of their own tale. So suffice it to say, that's a part of genres that we're not doing an everyman story of like Private So-and-so when we play most fantasy games. And so the answer to, you know, why will you confront, you know, or why will you get into confrontations with the bad guys if we don't force them, you know, is often a matter of actually having some exposition about what's so bad about bad guys. And so that's another kind of overlooked element of matter-of-fact gameplay is actually, and this is one of the difficult ones, is showing the, I don't want to say horror, but showing the true, some aspects of the true reality of the world as the characters behold it, and showing some suffering. And that this is one of the places where you can get labeled as a bad game master, as a bad guy, if you're showing human trafficking, if you're showing, you know, based on things that you've discussed in session 0 and what kind of lines and veils, if people see things that, you know, and I think you can be suggestive. You know, I think I grew up in an era where, you know, I watched MacGyver as a kid, and, you know, there were times where there were people who were in peril, and the villains had captured them, and the stakes were that this person would possibly, be killed if MacGyver didn't rescue them. The stakes were, you know, kind of suggestively communicated based on your age and your ability to understand it, that, you know, the villains might, that they were kind of creeps, I guess is a way to say it. And this was, you know, they were found ways, you know, in a TV PG, or I guess nowadays they call it probably TVG, a way to communicate that there's some urgency to fix this situation, and that these guys are not merely greedy. Something else is going on here. And villainizing the adversaries is a force of genre. And I think that it's something which, in matter-of-fact gameplay, it's you can't create set pieces. You can't always create like ideal ways of showing, and idealized distances, idealized comfortable ways of communicating this, because you can't premeditate every aspect of it. And so this often means that you will improvise based on a reality, people in some tough situations, or people who have already suffered some tough situations. Daenerys Targaryen walks down a road and she sees a lot of people who have suffered a certain fate and are hanging on a cruciform piece of wood, for example. That's a story, that's a thing that the characters might see in a matter-of-fact world, depending on what kind of genre you're in and what kind of level of villainy and stuff that you've set out and is thematic and important. So impacts and absences are the last thing that I want to cover about improvisation as a game master within the matter-of-fact paradigm. As in, when you see something, it's impactful. So, for example, we were playing a Star Wars campaign last year, and we did kind of wander in the desert, and we got off of the main planet that the players were really engaged in the rebellion upon. And the reason that the Empire had chosen to seize this world is because there was a force-using tradition among one of the indigenous people. And the Empire wanted to lock this down as a potential source of training for Luke Skywalker. This is just after the Battle of Yavin. And so there's an overt occupation which is pursued by the Empire to the planets of the Five Sisters to kind of close this access off to possible training in the Force for this new hero that the rebellion is flaunting about. And of course, the player characters are the people suffering the consequences, in many respects, of the people who live on those worlds. The absence of the Order Inquisitorius, the reason that the Inquisitors hadn't showed up yet, and what was going on with hauling these indigenous Force users onto transports and seeing them off to a gulag world, what did we see and what did we not see? Why was the rebellion not able to reach there? What was preoccupying them during that time? And that was one of the things that I had to think about and answer. I didn't, quite get there as far as, but I really engaged in a lot of thought about, okay, so there probably is an intelligence gathering arm that actually, is aware of this situation. What low-hanging fruit can the rebels, seize upon because the Empire is engaged here? Or, what is the squadrons that have unified under Mon Mothma's leadership? What are they doing right now? And why are the player characters alone in this fight? So that absence is, the reason for that absence is because somebody's off doing something else someplace else. Someday, you will get to that someplace else. Likewise, if you obliterate a given thing, its absence, it's the crater that is there, that vacuum. When something is destroyed, when the player characters are successful, what fills in that? Sometimes that can be a good thing in the sense that, if you vanquish those hill giants from that marshland, it may be that the next time you travel through that marshland, you see that the local peasants are able to kind of resume their fowling. They're able to start getting back to hunting, and that there's a whole thatching industry growing up around all the feathers which come from the fowling, and that there's in fact a master thatcher who is arising, who's able to give your character as a token of their success, as I talked about with those hill giants, some really master-crafted arrows, for example, or that person's ambitions are now on the rise, and that this person may become an assassin, or just a mercenary archer in the service of whomever they're able to gain the favor of. So, that new NPC arises from the consequences of a prior event, is what I mean to say. And that improvisation is just a matter of cause and effect sometimes. Now, backing it up with a lot of actual, elbow work and actual setting creation, drawing maps, sketching out towns, naming NPCs, building the world, you got to do it in this paradigm. At some point, you do have to actually think about the adversaries, because they may not die. They're not just put in front of the player characters to be killed. They have agendas, they have lives, they even have families. Another aspect of that is that, with maps and with, actually creating a fixed geography, is that you will have a two-way fog of war. The enemies, the neutrals, the animals in the world, You might say they don't know everything. That absence that I felt, where are the good aligned dragons in this world? What do they keep themselves busy with? I guess they must be busy eating ethically. That must be one of the things that keeps them busy, is that they have a very hard time sourcing their food without resorting to eating people or their livestock. Maybe that's the answer. But suffice it to say, the information about, this really fell goings on and how the dark god of Tiamat has come back to the world, where the heck are all the good aligned dragons in Tyranny of Dragons? Now, I mean, I guess maybe they do show up in the second book, but, literally, I don't think a silver dragon shows up and, has a conversation, even in a shape-shifted form, with, as an NPC, a concerned NPC in the Forgotten Realms adventure, which kicked off 5th edition. It's one of those things. It's like, okay, well, what was keeping them? Why did they not see? So sometimes you can answer these questions with, answers about why is there a fog of war? Why is the awareness of these situations leave the player characters the only ones who can react? And we see that a lot of time in Star Trek. It's like, we're the only ones that can get there in time. And we do see very often what the other ships in Starfleet busy themselves with. Or that we know that the Galaxy-class Enterprise 1701D is the fastest, literally orders of magnitude faster, and can react to things faster. So that's one of the reasons. So that's the creation. That's what you will arrive at. And you don't need to arrive at all of it. You don't need to know everything, because many campaigns won't last long enough, frankly, for you to have a complete picture, for you to have a reason to create every empire and the 2 empires over the hill. Just know that there probably is an empire over the hill. Know that there probably is on the other side of the world something like a China or an India analog, which is, there are threads like a Silk Road that pull upon the near paradigm. You don't need to enumerate everything about it, but just that awareness of the things over the horizon will inform your here and now and make it living. That's what matter-of-fact gameplay offers. As a game master, is the joy of being able to turn your mind's eye towards a place which is alive. And the questions which you need to answer week by week and moment by moment are questions which arise from the joy of playing with other people and often seeing and beholding them same sights together. That's the reason why I think it's really fun.